Okay, so a warm welcome to all the attendees of today's Future Driven Forum webinar. This webinar is all about PFAS, fluoropolymers, and the auto industry. We plan to kick off our discussion today by answering the questions: what are PFAS? What are fluoropolymers? And how are they different? And then this group is also going to talk about where fluoropolymers are used in the automotive industry, why they're used, and then whether any substitute chemicals are available for those uses. Then, once we've all got a good understanding of PFAS, we'll provide an overview of some of the key state and federal laws and regulations that relate to the use of PFAS by the auto industry. So before we get too far into that substance, I'd like to start by meeting our panelists. With us today are three fantastic experts on PFAS, if I do say so myself. On the panel, we first have Cy Jenna with the Chemours Company. Cy, would you like to say a quick hello and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Yes, I'm Cy Jenna. I work for the Chemours Company. Chemours is a chemical company that was derived and spun off of the DuPont company some 9 years ago. My personal career has spent a lot of time in their fluoropolymers business, moving from DuPont into Chemours. And only in the last few years, I've been focused on industry advocacy activities related to PFAS regulations. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your members.
Great, thanks, Cy. All right, so second, we have William Heslip with Freudenberg Sealing Technologies. William, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. So like you said, my name is William Heslip. I'm the Chemical Regulatory Compliance Manager for Freudenberg NOK Sealing Technologies. I've been with Freudenberg right out of university, so about 10 years now. And so I've been in the chemical regulatory industry for about 10 years. And just like most people in this industry, PFAS has been a large focus of my attention for, the last 3 years or so. Happy and excited to talk about it today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, William. And then finally, we've got Drew Rack from Toyota Motor North America. Drew, would you provide us a little introduction too, please?
Hi, Catherine. Yes, happy to be here. Happy to join Cy and William and yourself on today's webinar. Like you said, I work for Toyota Motor North America. I'm here in the Washington, D.C. office. I primarily focus on advocacy in the state and federal regulatory space for chemicals and materials. And I've been at Toyota only about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was with various Department of Defense activities working on chemical and materials issues.
All right, thanks all. Okay, so let's get into it. Cy, I want to start with you. I know that Chemours is a major manufacturer of some PFAS substances. So why don't you help us out by telling us what are PFAS?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. And here, I'll attempt not to dive too deeply into something that is pretty technical by its nature. But to understand the terminology of PFAS, I think you go back to a couple of substances, PFOA and PFOS, which really began to get a lot of scrutiny in the early 2000s, which led up to a voluntary discontinuance of using and making those particular chemicals. And along the way in 2011, someone wrote a technical paper that sort of showed how those substances related to a lot of other fluorinated substances, or fluorocarbons, if you wanted to generally describe them. And so the phrase, if you will, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances was defined, and it was understood to encompass a great many different substances. In 2021, an organization called OECD, who's written a lot of publications on the subject of PFAS and fluorinated compounds, updated the definition. And it was interesting in their doing so, they explained how complex this was, and ultimately even acknowledged that this was really such a broad categorization of chemistry that it probably wouldn't be well understood, nor should it be used in a regulatory context. And this is why you hear kind of different numbers of how many PFAS there are kind of generated from anywhere in the low thousands to the high thousands. And even I've heard numbers even higher than, the 12 or 14,000 that some people sort of have stopped at based on OECD's definition. So again, what it is really a broad category of substances sharing a common characteristic, which in this case is really a carbon fluorine bond of a certain kind, right? So again, per and poly refers to the number of fluorine involved. So again, it's a pretty complicated thing, but what happened again is substances having vastly different properties and characteristics were now grouped together, and ultimately this is what's being used in some of the regulatory activity in the world.
Yep. Well, I think that's a good explanation. Now, we've also got the term fluoropolymers in the title of this webinar. I think Auto Innovators talks a lot about how the auto industry uses fluoropolymers in its vehicles. So maybe you could explain for us a little bit what a fluoropolymer is and why it's a little bit different from that broader class of PFAS.
Sure. So from the broadest grouping of PFAS, there were two main subgroupings, non-polymeric and polymeric. Again, this relates to characteristics that define a polymer, which is, again, a certain length of chain of carbons. It's derived from a certain kind of reaction, and there's some scientific definition around that. But it's really where the stark difference between these substances can be seen, because fluoropolymers, because of their high molecular weight nature, can be demonstrated not to have certain characteristics like bioavailability, solubility in water, or other, even lots of other things. So ultimately, the fluoropolymers were within this grouping of PFAS, the polymeric among the polymeric substances. So what a fluoropolymer then is really, as people understand it from the brands that we carry, the Teflon and Viton brands, is a highly inert substance that's used in a variety of different ways, because of their unique combination of properties. So again, distinguishing, and maybe as a contrast, some fluorinated gases would be classified as PFAS, and it's clearly not the similar product with the similar kind of characteristics as the PTFE or ETFE that's used in insulating a wire or making a tube so that you can have a hose, that can handle corrosive chemicals. So I'm leaning a little toward, how these fluoropolymers are used, but I think that sort of creates the basis of understanding that this is a subgrouping within the broader universe of PFAS.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's really helpful. Because I think we talk a lot in our advocacy kind of about, the potential for when regulators are looking to control PFAS exposures, maybe separating a little bit out the broader PFAS classification and maybe removing fluoropolymers from what they're considering for regulation. You touched upon it a little bit in talking about uses of fluoropolymers, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, when generally the media or others talk about PFAS, PFAS is currently found in all sorts of stuff, right? It's found in food containers, it's found in waterproof clothing, it's certainly found in automobiles, as we're going to talk about. But could you tell us a little bit about why, these particular chemicals are chosen for use in those sorts of applications?
Yes. So again, it's attributed to a unique combination of properties. So in the world of polymers, of plastics or polymers that are available to use in various ways, there are performance parameters. So the things that fluoropolymers do is they retain their properties across a very wide range of temperature. They are inert to very corrosive substances, and they have very good electrical properties for insulation. So but it's typically true of some other material that you could get good insulation properties or you could get temperature resistance. But when you need both of them, and especially, or low coefficient of friction, where perhaps exposure to a chemical would affect it. So you're using them in lubricants, fluorinated polymers go, in lubrication applications. But again, it's always typically because there are other materials, it's where a combination of conditions and demands, can't be met by one of those other kinds of materials. So that's ultimately drives it into many, aspects of automobiles in particular, because again, you have high temperatures, you have corrosive fluids, and you have need for lubrication that needs to be durable. And those are the sort of drivers of how you would end up, using these materials in various systems throughout an automobile.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally on par with what I know. PFAS just, deliver durability, they deliver performance qualities. The average vehicle on the road today is 12 years old. So we need parts and systems that are going to keep that vehicle and its all its parts and systems working for that length of time. And I know that you guys are an upstream supplier in our industry of fluoropolymers. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more of a specific examples of where fluoropolymers can be found in vehicles, the different systems and parts.
Yeah, so a good example again is in high temperature areas of the vehicle where they may be used in cable insulation. Certainly, oxygen sensors are a common application where again the exposure to temperature and hot gases, it requires a material that won't break down. You have again a number of lubricant type applications, everything from sunroof and window lubrication to, probably other more critical squeak and rattle type of uses. Fuel lines are a very common use, again, because of the ability to prevent permeation. And in fact, some of the emission reduction that automobile makers have been able to achieve has been achieved by the use of some of these materials, either in their own or through different combinations. So again, it's really wherever you see these sort of wide ranging or high or very low or very high temperatures, the fluids like such as brake fluid and gasoline and fuel, all of those things are sort of drivers for why a fluoropolymer would be a good material of construction.
Yeah. So kind of a follow-up question to that. You talked a little bit about gasoline related stuff. I also know that PFAS can be found in like engine gaskets, but Auto Innovators had said before that the future is electric. So I'm wondering, are these substances still used in electric cars, or will this problem kind of go away as the industry shifts towards electrification?
Yeah, it's certain that the internal combustion engine drove a certain amount of those, like you say, the seals and gaskets. I don't know how I forgot to mention that, but ultimately, the fuel presence and makes a difference. And again, that you're not burning it with hot gases. But I do believe we'll find that there are a number of applications that are enabled in the electrification of vehicles, not the least of which is batteries, which use PVDF and PTFE as binder materials. Some of those kinds of things require gaskets and seals that won't fail as well under high temperatures. I think William will probably have a lot more knowledge about the sealing specific applications, but certainly what we're going to see is some shift from those that were driven more specifically from a internal combustion type design to an electric. But again, I think new ones will emerge too. So again, even things where, and I didn't mention, but in Chemours' portfolio, we also have fluorinated gases. So some of the refrigerants and heat exchange fluids that are effectively used today, are also fluorinated chemicals, some of which are classified as PFAS. And those may be instrumental in electrification as well as the fluoropolymers themselves. So I don't think those needs are going to go away entirely, but certainly some of those applications will shift. And as you mentioned, there will be a large fleet of internal combustion engines on the road for a long time to come. So I think there'll still be interest in maintaining the standard of performance. And I should mention, in many cases, ultimately raising the performance of safety in that system, right? So again, the prevention of catastrophic failure is something that you can derive from using materials that don't break down and withstand those kinds of difficult conditions.
And I guess I can just kind of echo what you said a little bit, in that just because you're changing from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle, maybe the kind of, or the specific type of environment that you're putting that seal, the gasket, the O-ring, whatever in, is going to change, but you still have the properties that you want to achieve, which is the resistance to the chemicals, or the resistance to the high variance of temperature, hot or cold. That is still going to be present in a car, whether it's a gas vehicle or an electric vehicle.
I mean, I think that's all a really great explanation as to why we've got these PFAS in vehicles today. I mean, part of the reason that we're talking about PFAS in this webinar is because there are pressures out there to get PFAS substances out of consumer products, and the definition of consumer products, will often capture vehicles. So Sai is kind of the chemicals expert over at Chemours. I was wondering if you could tell us, are you aware of some alternative substances out there for a lot of these uses, or is PFAS really the material of choice at this time?
Well, again, I think there are known alternatives, and some of it is how you apply engineering to solve the problem. So if you have challenges with temperature or permeation, there may be ways around it, that would allow other materials to work. But of the known polymers, again, they all have shortcomings when it comes to certain combinations of temperature, friction, dielectric property, mechanical properties, retention over time, and all those things. And again, useful life, again, certain things you might be able to replace, but the consequence will be a much shorter maintenance cycle. So again, I think that relates well to the automobile and how the industry wants its vehicles to perform. So certain changes like head gaskets, for example, are probably conceivable with a different material being used in that gasket. But I don't think the consumer will favor frequent changes of the head gasket, right? So I think those are kinds of trade-offs. And I think ultimately, when it comes to alternatives, for certain known conditions, there are no other alternatives. And for others, you may be able to, get a compromise that you're willing to accept. But ultimately, there will be some compromise to the performance.
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. I think the auto industry, when it looks to replace chemicals in vehicles, what it finds a fair amount of time is that chemicals of choice are chosen because they meet many different necessary standards for performance of that substance or that part. And if you try something new out, you may still get 7 out of 10 of those things met, but you'll be sure, something, as you said, will wear out more quickly. It won't be as durable, that there may have cost implications, and vehicles have to meet all sorts of safety and environmental standards, and durability standards as well. So it's definitely a tricky process to figure out how to properly replace a chemical in a vehicle.
And I do want to add that the interest in getting rid of all PFAS again is a sort of a policy approach, if you will. What we're advocating is that for the fluoropolymers, because of their critical nature and uses, that it's important that we figure out how to produce them responsibly. Part of the reason of the concern isn't because of the fluoropolymer itself, but it's because of manufacturing processes or end of life fates. And so as an industry and as a company, we're pursuing and interested in and investing in the best available technology to abate emissions, to reduce residuals in our products, and so that, in other words, we can sustain the availability of these materials. But again, it's very complicated now because they've been cast together with quite a number of other materials that are used in quite a number of other ways. So that's sort of, from an advocacy position, how we're approaching it.
Well, thanks, Sai. And we've gotten a little bit into talking about policy directions and choices and that sort of thing. So now I think that we've got a good overview of PFAS and where they are in vehicles and kind of why they're so important for our vehicles. Maybe we can move on to covering a little bit of the regulations that are in place on PFAS and that may impact PFAS in vehicles. Drew and William, I know that you've been following kind of developments in that regulatory and legislative space pretty closely. So Drew, I'll start by asking you, which states have laws that are in place that impact use of PFAS by the auto industry? Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about those programs?
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. And just to reiterate what Sai introduced with, PFAS is an enormous, approximately 14,000 different chemicals. We're focused today on the fluoropolymers, which is a smaller subset, but still a rather extensive subset. So when the states are looking at regulating PFAS, just keep in mind that the states are regulating the entire class of approximately 14,000 different chemicals. And so a state regulation is not going to generally just be focused on fluoropolymers. It's going to drag everything else in along with it. So the first state that experimented with or looked into regulating PFAS was Maine back in 2021. And they really came out with a four-part type of regulatory approach to initially ban some products, require disclosure on where PFAS is used, require the payment of fees, and then also look at just broad use exemptions. As they were looking into that, they kind of scaled that back in 2023 and really looked at focusing on, I'd say, much simpler consumer products and really scaling down their particular approach. But at the same time, we had Minnesota pass its initial statute to look at complex consumer goods that would include vehicles. Very similar approach where you have an initial ban of certain products. In the case of Minnesota, it will start in 2025, so just a couple weeks from now. But in addition to the ban, you've got reporting that would be required for PFAS. You have some fees that will be required, and then you'll also have some time-limited use exemptions that industry would be able to apply for. So Minnesota and Maine are definitely the top two. I would say other states, including Washington and California, under their Safer Consumer Products programs, are definitely looking at PFAS and are putting out regulations. And then as a third group of states, you would have states similar to Colorado, in New Hampshire and Connecticut, where they are taking, I would say, small steps towards initial bans of simpler consumer products, maybe cookware types of approaches, outerwear, rain jackets, tents, that sort of thing. And California is also doing a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And I think kind of as you started off with, Maine and Minnesota are right now are two of the bigger areas of concern for the auto industry because of two elements of their laws. One is reporting requirements, which in Minnesota apply to everybody, right? And then also the potential need to phase out PFAS in the products before a certain deadline or otherwise get a currently unavoidable use exemption. And,
Right.
I know that the general kind of legal and regulatory process is that you have laws that are passed by the legislature and kind of build out a skeleton to, the PFAS program in the states. And then it's the role of the state agencies to develop regulations that provide detail for the programs and really kind of help in practically implementing the law. So maybe could you tell us what's the status of the kind of regulatory and program development in states like Maine and Minnesota?
Yeah, so both Maine and Minnesota will have a lot of activity in 2025 to put out the regulations that implement the laws that were passed earlier. As you said, those regulations are really going to have to define and spend a lot of time on defining exactly what is a carpet. I know how we use the term carpet in the automotive industry is probably not the same as the term carpet that might be on the floor in a building. So they will be spending a lot of time also describing exactly how you report. For example, would you report at the vehicle level? A vehicle may have up to 30,000 components. Would you also report PFAS in some percentage of those 30,000 components that contain PFAS? And then also because as the length of time that a vehicle is on the road, you have a significant number of components and replacement parts that were produced years ago that are sitting on a shelf. And what would be done in terms of reporting the content of those particular items that might be used tomorrow, they might be used in 10 years. It really depends on when the article is needed. So again, 2025 will be spent by the agencies. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency or the Maine Department of Environmental Protection will be very busy in 2025, probably into 26 and 27, developing those regulations.
Got it. Thanks, Drew. And I think you covered pretty well kind of some of the areas of concern that the auto industry has with respect to those programs, which are, kind of how many of our parts are we reporting? How much of our vehicles are reporting? How many lines of reports is that per state? But I wanted to see if you kind of wanted to highlight any other concerns that you as an automaker might, or the industry generally might have kind of about those programs.
Yeah, certainly. The reporting is a very, very large issue. You've got many different makes and models for an automobile. So are you reporting on all the trim lines or only some of the trim lines? Do you report on a trim line that is a combination of all possible trim lines? And how would that actually work? How do you communicate? So that's one problem, is reporting. How do you communicate the requirements down through the supply chain from the very top to the bottom, so everyone is aware of what needs to be reported? And it's not just a matter of reporting moving forward, but then again, what do you do with those parts and components that were produced years ago? Obviously, there's also the potential for a limited use exemption. One of the concerns we have is right now, many of the limited use exemptions are time limited. And as most of the folks that would be attending this webinar will know, vehicles are on a 10 to 15 year use cycle. So you have to keep that in mind when looking for a limited use exemption that would perhaps be for 3 or 4 years, is not going to be very valuable in the automotive space.
Thanks, Drew. So I'm going to turn over kind of to the federal side of things. William, I'll turn to you and ask, so what are the requirements that are in place federally?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that's happening right now on a federal level is the TSCA 8A7 reporting requirement that came out a little bit ago. We just heard a lot about the states and all the actions that the states are taking in order to tackle this PFAS problem. The states saw this issue as PFAS or with PFAS and decided that they wanted to tackle it right away. They started getting these regulations out and tried to limit, the uses and such. The EPA understands that PFAS is an issue, but they also understand that there are a lot of PFAS substances, and they don't have a full grasp on where PFAS is in the US, how it's being used, and all of that. And so they wanted to issue this ruling to gather as much information on PFAS within the United States as possible so that they can then later use that information to inform rulemaking in the future. And so that's the big thing right now, is this mandatory reporting within the United States through TSCA for any PFAS that was manufactured from the year 2011 to 2012. You have to report a slew of information to the EPA regarding that PFAS. Their definition of manufacture also includes import. So, you're not off the hook if you don't actually make the PFAS yourself. If you import that PFAS into the United States, you're also within scope for reporting. And there's no exemption for articles either, like there is for a lot of the rulemakings that come out of TSCA.
I just want to help correct something William said, 2011 to 2022. So part of the onerousness of this rule is that it has a 10-year span of reporting. And yes, and even has been acknowledged by EPA that they couldn't establish a system in something like 3 years now since they proposed that rule that could actually accommodate collecting this data. But I think it is a really important difference between the states and the federal government to note that federal government is interested in collecting information to figure out where the risk is and basically staying at a more substance-based approach, although this rule was notably not based on a certain list of substances. But ultimately, they're going ahead to collect this. This is taking years to do, and the states were saying, we're not going to sit around and wait for that. So it was kind of an interplay there that, but we'll see. Hopefully when this data is collected, it sheds light in ways that helps, move us toward a prioritization, again, because of the vastness of the substances involved and the uses involved that, ultimately, I think that was the objective.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think you said when this data is collected. So I wanted to ask William, when is this data going to be collected? When does the reporting period start?
So a little bit of what Cy touched on, the data is going to be collected using the EPA's, they call it the Central Data Exchange, and it's just their like online platform for collecting data. This was originally going to start, I think this month, something like November of this year, was when they originally wanted to start gathering this data and have companies report. But they had some technical issues, budget constraints. Something happened where they just weren't ready to start gathering, all of this information, and so it was pushed back. Now the date that you are available to start reporting your information is July 11th of 2025, and you have until January 11th of 2026 in order to finish your reporting. So you have a little bit of a window there, July to January of the next year, in order to get your data in. Though I would say that, as was highlighted, it's a lot of information that they're expecting you to report, going over a large period of time, 10, 11 years of information. So you should start gathering this data for the reporting as soon as possible if you haven't started already. Just because the reporting period is, July to January, you want to start getting that information now because it's a lot of information that's expected.
And I'll add just a little bit to what William is saying. The federal definition under TSCA 8A7 for PFAS is not the same definition for PFAS that the states are using. So you should not assume that you'll be able to use the federal data to satisfy the state requirement. They are very different types of reporting, starting from the very basic requirement that they each define PFAS differently.
And so you have the states using this definition, and maybe you know it by heart better than I do, Drew, but it basically, if you have a carbon fluorine bond somewhere in the material, it's considered a PFAS. Whereas the TSCA reporting requirement has a structural definition for PFAS. They kind of break it down into 3 different structures that if your material or chemical falls under one of those structural definitions, then you have to report. There isn't like a CAS number list or a list of specific substances that you say, if it's on this list, you have to report. They did release a list of, I think it was around 1,400 substances, where they said, these are ones that we think fall under the structural definition, but this isn't an exhaustive list, and this shouldn't be your end-all be-all for determining your reporting requirements. It's still up to you to determine whether your material, your substance, falls under the structural definition. So they gave a little bit of guidance with a CAS number list, but it's not an exhaustive list, and they still expect you to know the difference with the structure.
Yeah. The other difference is the EPA 8A7 reporting requirements are looking backwards. Cy kind of talked to the time period. The state requirements are looking forward, and so you would have to update your reporting anytime there was a significant change in the type or concentration of PFAS that are being used. And that's the significant change is one of those things that Catherine mentioned. The states are going to have to figure out exactly what does the phrase significant change mean as they're finalizing their regulations. But that would be a requirement that is ongoing into the future.
Yeah, I guess that's a good thing to highlight. This TSCA reporting requirement is a one-time reporting obligation. It is mandatory. You have to do it. It extends, for the 10 or 11 years, but it is only once that you have to gather the data. Whereas, like you said, the states are moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great clarification. And I kind of wanted to get back to something that you were saying, William, and tie together 2 points to ask you a question, which was, we've talked a lot about the broad scope of the data that EPA is requiring for reporting, the fact that it covers, 10 plus years. Drew also talked a little bit about the difficulties of getting that information from the supply chain. You need your lower tier suppliers is someone that might be reporting to tell you what the content, of their products is, what chemistries are in it. So the question I would ask to you is, William, we've got reporting coming up, in just over 6 months. You've kind of advised, and I think you're totally right, that, companies that have compliance obligations with respect to that should be preparing to report. But so my question to you is, like, how hard do I need to be trying to gather all this information in the next 6 months? How, do I need to be contacting everybody 10 tiers down my supply chain to get that information? Kind of bothering companies, what if companies went out of business? What kind of counsel might be out there on how hard I have to try to get information for reporting?
So unfortunately, I don't have an easy answer to this. So within the rule that the EPA released, they had this standard for the information that you had to provide, and it was basically they said you have to report information that is known or reasonably ascertainable by you. So break that down a little bit. What is known is fairly easy. Do you currently have that information on you? It's the reasonably ascertainable that gets a little bit more vague. So basically, you have to report information that is reasonable for you to obtain if you don't have it already. So what is reasonable for you to obtain? The EPA said that um, this is going to be different for every company because different companies have different situations that they're in. Like you said, it could be, their supplier has gone out of business. Maybe they're using a different system or software within the company and the old information is, in this old software system. So what is reasonably ascertainable is going to be different from company to company. And also the resources that are available to each company might be different. A small company versus a large company could have a larger team to get the resources. But basically, they want you to make a reasonable attempt at getting information that you don't have. And it's kind of up to you to define that yourself on what is a reasonable attempt. But you are expected to contact your suppliers once, twice, whatever it may be, but you don't have to contact that supplier 10 times, call them, drive down to their offices and knock on their door. There's a level of, reasonableness to how you have to try and get that information, that data.
No, and I've had some people kind of ask me that question before. It's a really hard one to answer, and I think you're probably right that that's one of those things where entities that find that they have compliance obligations probably need to review the EPA materials and then kind of consult with their counsel or other teams to figure out, kind of as you said, what's reasonable and feasible for them.
Unfortunately, there's no one answer that's the same for all companies, and each company that has an obligation to report is going to have to review it themselves and determine what reasonable means for them. I guess I will point out that the EPA has said that, if you have determined that you aren't going to report information or that you're unable to find information, keep track of that. Keep track of what you did, what your attempts were, and your reasoning behind it. Because if they do, if there's an audit or something where they come asking questions, you want to be able to present them with an answer on, hey, we did this XYZ thing in order to try and get that information. We weren't able to get it, but here's what we tried to do.
No, I think that's a really good point. Definitely good practice. So we kind of talked a little bit about, what we'll be watching from the states and from EPA in 2025. EPA is going to be kind of getting ready to stand up that reporting system, as we've talked about. The states, as Drew mentioned, are going to be working on implementing regulations for their PFAS programs. In 2025, we'll see federally the dawn of another Trump administration. At the start of the year, we'll see a lot of legislatures that will open session. So this is kind of an open question to the panel. What sorts of things will you be watching for in the PFAS policy space in 2025? Maybe, Sai, we can start with you if you have a thought on that one.
Sure. Again, I think there's a certain amount of uncertainty relative to the new administration. I think it's reasonable to expect again that some things might be stalled or rolled back, but at the same time, I know the EPA feels confident. I heard somebody present here recently that the rules that they've issued are going to stick, and to that extent, I think preparing for compliance is the appropriate course of action. I think from an industry point of view, we would prefer to have some science-based, coherent, regulations to work under. And I think that's what we'll continue to advocate for. In other words, that we're not really, we don't think that a absence of regulation is what's needed here. What we need are science-based, risk-based, and achievable types of restrictions, again, that we can apply our technology to and improve our reduced environmental impact, protect the health and environment while producing these kinds of materials and enabling their uses and across all these different critical industries. So again, I don't expect one thing might be, and I'll defer to Drew or William, who might be more close to this, but I think any lack of action at the federal level will probably inspire the states to get even more energetic. So I don't think that that's the course that we want to have happen. I think what we'd rather move toward is some sort of cohesive science-based approach.
And I'll just
Yeah.
I'll just pick up on size. Yes, I do think the states are going to be inspired, I think was your word, Sai. Absolutely. I think in 2025 and beyond, we'll see the states that already have statutes in place. We talked about Maine, Minnesota. They'll continue with their regulations. We will see states that maybe passed a regulation last year that only regulated maybe 3 or 4 items. They might add a 5th or 6th or 7th item. I think they'll be looking at what their peers geographically are doing. So, Vermont and New Hampshire will look across and see what Maine is doing, and so will Connecticut. Michigan will look over and see, what Minnesota is doing. There is geographic reciprocity in terms of what one state is doing. They often look at what their neighboring states are doing. So we will see, again, regulatory development. We'll see increased statutes. And then lastly, in those states where a statute has been perhaps just under the radar, we will see those states move forward to step into the void and pass brand new legislation. The sticky part of that for not just the auto industry, but industry in general, will be all of the varying deadlines. So for example, if there is a ban on floor mats in state A, and then states B and C and D also come up with bans on PFAS and floor mats, we're all going to have to keep all of those various deadlines in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, William, I don't know if you have kind of any thoughts for 2025 that haven't been covered.
Yeah,
Drew
I mean,
covered a
I
lot of
would
it
basically
as
just
well.
echo what Drew said. We have the TSCA reporting, which will be, due, or at least you can start reporting in 2025. But to me, that's a known thing. We know what those requirements are. What I'm going to be watching the most, in 2025 and beyond, is what the states decide to do regarding their PFAS restrictions and requirements. And Drew highlighted the differences between what the restrictions and requirements are between the states and the deadlines that you're going to have to keep track of. One of the things that I'm personally worried about is the reporting requirements for each of the different states. If 20 different states each have different reporting requirements on what you have to report, and then also when those reports are due, that's going to be an immense data gathering nightmare and reporting nightmare for doing that for every state that has these requirements. So I'm going to be keeping a close eye on those as well as we move forward.
No, I think that's a good answer that really kind of brings to the fore a lot of the concerns that the industry has about compliance. Watching all these various deadlines, differing action in the states, kind of figuring out what information you need for compliance and how to manage that. And all that sort of kind of effort is time and money, from companies too that are required to comply. So can't let that go without that being said. But maybe since we're coming close to the end of our time today, I wonder if each of you has kind of maybe one big takeaway that you would want to share from our discussion of PFAS in vehicles, and PFAS and kind of regulation, that sort of thing. So maybe we'll start with Sai again.
Sure. Well, again, I hope it's clearer now how fluoropolymers fit in within this class of PFAS, and also that understanding about the critical uses of those materials, not just in automotive, but in transportation more broadly, but medical and semiconductor and chemical processing of any kind. And so what you have is again in fluoropolymers is a material that's critical in so many different sectors, that there's an interdependency among those sectors to having those materials available. So again, this is why we're advocating on that basis that we figure out regulations and approaches to manufacturing that are going to allow us to sustain the supply and grow to meet the needs, because we do see where there are policy objectives and climate change and other areas which are the technology is really enabled by the use of fluoropolymers. So we would like to see those things kind of reconciled, and ultimately, again, I hope that's the takeaway for your members and for any others who are able to watch this.
I think that's a great one. Drew, do you kind of have one big takeaway you would want to share?
Yeah, so whether it be a fluoropolymer or whether the PFAS be an F gas, um, the auto industry, as well as the entire transportation sector, as Sai alluded to, uses PFAS to achieve safety, performance, and provide capability. We talked a little bit about replacements. It is a very large class of compounds, so we are not going to have one drop-in that achieves all of the safety, performance, and capability requirements that we have. We will continue, obviously, to move forward, to look at replacements and implement those where possible, and then really having to try to satisfy the number of requirements at the state and federal levels without them being duplicative.
William, I don't know if you have one as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, Sai and Drew kind of spoke to the material side of things. The takeaway that I would want people to focus on, going back to the regulatory side of things, is don't underestimate the time and effort it's going to be to respond to the TSCA reporting requirements or these state reporting requirements, or even now, Canada has just released their own reporting requirements regarding PFAS manufactured or imported into Canada. Don't underestimate the time and effort it's going to take to respond to these and start as soon as you can if you haven't started already.
Yeah. No, I think those are three really great ones. Poly or PFAS substances are used in a lot of applications, including vehicles. They're used for important purposes, environmental and safety reasons. And if you don't know about your uses, then you should be learning about your uses to prepare for compliance with some of the laws and regulations that we talked about today. So with those kind of final thoughts, I think we'll bring this discussion to a close. I want to say thank you so much to Cy, William, and to Drew for joining me today. And thank you to all of those who tuned in online. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.